Thank you very much, Matt. And I've been particularly looking forward to this session too. Neil started right out in his intro comments talking about the importance of inequality. Helen Clark mentioned that COVID has globally increased inequality, and New Zealand is no exception. That certainly came through in the last session on education. So, I'm really looking forward to the insights that our panellists today will bring. Our two distinguished panellists that we have with us today, we have Professor Jonathan Boston from the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. And we have Matt Burgess from the New Zealand Initiative. Very, very much looking forward to the insights that each of the panellists are going to bring. But I'm also looking forward to the probing questions that the audience will bring that will really draw on the expertise of our panellists. So keep those Slido questions rolling in. And with that, I'd like to pass straight over to you, Jonathan. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Anna. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this forum. Currently, New Zealand has significant disparities in income and wealth. These include both intra- and intergenerational disparities, along with ethnic, gender, and geographic disparities. Our attitude to these disparities is inevitably shaped by our philosophical, ideological, and religious convictions. There is no moral neutrality in this space. The territory is inherently value-laden and deeply contested. People disagree about both the ends and the means, and of course there's much complexity. For multiple ethical reasons, I believe that a just or fair society requires a broadly egalitarian approach. And this entails at least four things. First, a strong commitment to the equal value, worth, and dignity of every person, supported by a comprehensive set of equal citizenship rights. Second, a requirement to satisfy every person's basic needs, which in turn means minimizing income-based poverty and material hardship. Third, a commitment to intergenerational justice, which includes protecting ecological integrity and sustainability. And fourth, support for the principle of fair equality of opportunity applied broadly, but also to specific goods and services like education, which was the subject of a previous discussion. Our current relatively high rates of income and wealth inequality, with Gini coefficients in this country for both well above 30%, are not consistent, in my view, with these principles of justice. Moreover, there is reliable international evidence that higher rates of income and wealth inequality tend, other things being equal, to reduce social cohesion and trust, increase corruption, weaken democratic institutions, and exacerbate ecological degradation. There was a good case, in my view, for reducing income and wealth inequality in New Zealand well before the COVID-19 pandemic. But the pandemic has almost certainly increased wealth inequality and worsened intergenerational inequality, given the massive increase in house prices. The current ecological crises, climate, biodiversity loss, and so on, will ultimately impose vast additional costs on future generations unjustly. The pandemic has not, however, worsened poverty. Stats New Zealand released their latest poverty data this morning for the year ended June 2021. And in brief, across the three key primary poverty measures, child poverty rates, which essentially measure family poverty, these rates remained broadly stable over recent years or declined slightly. As a result, two of the three intermediate targets that the government set for child poverty reduction have been met. Nevertheless, significant rates of poverty remain, and there has been little change to the rates of severe material hardship over recent years, which is particularly concerning. I had expected material hardship rates to increase in the year to June 2021 because of the pandemic, but it did not, perhaps for two reasons. First, the government's multiple COVID response measures appear to have been relatively successful. For example, median household disposable incomes were up around 4.5% in the year to June 2021. Second, Stats New Zealand doesn't interview destitute people or those in emergency housing. And it is quite likely that the COVID pandemic increased the number of such people. For those who accept the case for lower rates of income and wealth inequality, including less poverty, the fundamental question is how to do so in the most cost-effective and sustainable manner. And there's no simple answer. Unfortunately, there is a powerful political asymmetry at work. It is much easier politically to increase inequality than to reduce it. Also, in a globalized world, there are constraints on what individual nations can do. Broadly speaking, the key to reducing economic inequality is enhancing the redistributive impact of the tax and welfare system or the transfer system. On the tax side, there are obviously various options, but they're all problematic for one reason or another. The options include capital gains taxes, land taxes, wealth taxes, inheritance or wealth transfer taxes like the lifetime gifts tax in Ireland, and more progressive income taxes. And I note that at least some OECD economists favour a combination of a capital gains tax and an inheritance tax. On the income transfer side, the current options in New Zealand include more generous welfare benefits, more generous tax credits, such as the family tax credit, linking core benefit rates to prices as well as wages, as they are now, and increasing the age of eligibility for New Zealand super, say, to 70 years. In relation to housing, which Matt will probably speak more about, housing is critical to wealth inequality. And it's interesting that New Zealand successfully increased home ownership rates very substantially during the immediate post-war period and significantly increased the social housing stock as a proportion of the total housing stock. And ideally, we need to do both these things again because we went backwards for the last 40 years. I realize that will be difficult, not least fiscally. So to conclude, as an egalitarian, I lament the current levels of income and wealth inequality, locally and globally. I think they're thoroughly bad. I accept, however, that there's no optimal level of economic inequality, but I would prefer less for the reasons I've indicated. There is, however, no easy way to achieve this goal, but in my view, we should at least try. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for those rich insights and your perspective, and including some very, very fresh data. So that was great to keep us up to date with the latest data that's been released there. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Matt, let's turn to your insights, please. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to speak. Helen Clark was right. Wealth inequality has increased in this country over the last 2 years. Gini Wealth Index has increased from 67 2 years ago to 69 or 70, depending on which source you look at. Our wealth inequality is about double on the Gini measure of income inequality. It's substantially higher, but that's in line with most, if not all, other countries around the world. Wealth is just less equal when you look around the world compared to income. The good news is that New Zealand is at the bottom end of the wealth inequality when you look across countries. We're in the, I guess you'd say, the best or the least unequal 20% of countries around the world. And we're actually moving down that scale towards more inequality in relative terms compared to other countries. So that's the good news of the story. Now, of course, the reason we're talking about wealth distribution is because over the last 2 years in particular, asset prices have essentially gone vertical. And in New Zealand, of course, it's housing of all assets that matters the most. Housing is about half our net wealth of the average household in this country. It's a big deal. And of course, prices have gone not quite vertical, but not too far from it. The average house in New Zealand is now $1 million. The average house price in Auckland City, $1.7 million. These numbers are shocking, in my view. New Zealand has the worst performing housing market in the OECD. over the last 30 years in terms of real increase in prices. So we've got a serious problem. But in terms of wealth distribution, housing has actually had a negative impact on inequality. A really interesting study from Treasury recently showed that the increase in house prices has improved or reduced inequality within the group of homeowners, which is a large group. 64% of houses are owner-occupied in this country. It's increased inequality between non-homeowners and homeowners, but that's a small enough group that the within homeowner group effect dominates. So surprisingly, housing has actually had a negative impact on wealth inequality, even though wealth inequality overall has increased in the last 2 years. Treasury 10% increase in house prices reduces wealth inequality by 0.7%, which is quite a substantial effect. So look, why does wealth inequality matter? And I think there's at least two reasons why we need to think about it, or it's worth considering. The first is, what's the relationship between wealth distribution and social outcomes that we care about? Do changes in wealth distribution tell us something about outcomes for people on the ground? And the second, I think, particularly with respect to housing, is the increase in housing telling us something or leading to exclusion, which for such an important asset class? So looking at the literature on wealth inequality, it's not a huge literature because I think in part wealth is hard to measure, particularly in this country where we don't tax it. The relationship between wealth distribution and social outcomes like life expectancy, education outcomes, infant mortality is surprisingly ambiguous. Essentially, there is no consistent relationship with wealth distribution and those outcomes in the way there is with that other measure of inequality, income inequality. So in terms of a metric that you can look at and infer bad things are happening on the ground for real people, wealth distribution and changes in wealth distribution isn't a particularly good measure. Income inequality is much more interesting and arguably important compared to wealth, even though wealth, of course, has been on the news over the last couple of years. In terms of house prices, home ownership rates have fallen substantially, I think, as Jonathan mentioned. 73% home ownership rate 30 years ago, all the way down to 64% today. The change, who's won and lost from that fall in home ownership? 20 and 30-year-olds have lost by more than other age categories, but not by that much. Another interesting thing, share of first home buyers of all home sales has been roughly static over the last 20 years. There hasn't been a collapse in first home buyers. They're still buying about a quarter of all home purchases. So on its face, the picture in terms of exclusion, despite this massive increase in house prices, is that not too many people are being locked out of the market in the way we might have expected. But one final data point on this, which comes from Australia, I couldn't find an equivalent number for New Zealand. What percentage of first home buyers are getting help from their parents? In 2010, 12 years ago, in Australia, that number was 3%. Today, it's 60%. And if it's anything like something similar going on here in New Zealand, that could be a serious question. For those whose parents don't own homes, aren't in the market, they may well be excluded, and that's potentially a very serious issue. So look, I'll wrap it up there, but I think, in terms of the outlook, it's been an interesting picture statistically. It hasn't yet turned into serious outcomes at the front line on social outcomes. But ahead of us, now we've got inflation, we've got interest rate rises on the horizon, we've got rents going up by 10% in the last year. Rents have been a safety valve in the New Zealand housing market. We've had persistent increases in house prices over the last 3 decades, more than anywhere else in the OECD. Rents have been pretty stable in this country, and now they're taking off. So it's potentially we're in uncharted territory and potentially interesting and dangerous territory, I think, over the next 2 years potentially. Back to you, Anna.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks for very sharply reminding us of the importance of housing to equality issues, and my kids will certainly be hoping that the Australian data applies to New Zealand as well. Thanks also for, sharply reminding us of the importance of looking at income versus wealth inequality, because there are some significant differences there. What I'd like to do now is move on to a few questions. The first question is actually going to be addressed to both of you, and that is, let's say you've got a magic policy wand. Both of you express some desire to reduce inequality, perhaps in different forms, but what's the number one policy intervention with this magic policy wand? What's the number one policy intervention that you would make to reduce inequality?
Do you want me to start, Anna?
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yes. Okay. So I don't think there's one magic wand here. We need a combination of measures, and those measures would need to be applied over a significant period of time to make a substantive and sustained difference. So I would be, as I was sort of indicating in my remarks, trying to pull both the tax levers and the income transfer levers. There may be also labour market levers one could move as well, but I would focus on the tax transfer system. I'm not a tax policy expert, but from what I've read, I think there is a reasonably convincing case for a capital gains tax, a reasonably comprehensive capital gains tax, and I certainly think there's a case for some kind of inheritance tax or a lifetime gift tax. On the transfer side, I would argue, as I have over many years, for a further increase in core welfare benefits and for more generous tax credits, particularly the family tax credit. And I would also argue for increasing the age of eligibility for New Zealand super. We now have a situation where an ever-increasing number of people aged 65 plus are working, and yet they're eligible for universal, relatively low-taxed income transfer. And I don't think that is either fair or reasonable in the kind of circumstances we're in. So a raft of measures, many of which would be politically very difficult to introduce.
So lots of policy wands is what you would like, Matt?
Fix the housing market. I might be a broken record on this, I'm afraid, but look, housing really matters. When you look at the before and after housing cost data, particularly Brian Perry at MSD, housing's enormous. I mean, it really is. New Zealand, we're pretty good on a lot of things, but we're terrible at housing, and it affects everybody. It affects those at the bottom the most, actually. Higher proportion of income goes on housing if you're in the bottom end of income, and it's a big number. So, and if you want to get really specific about the thing to fix in housing, it is that housing supply. That's not more subsidies, and it's convincing councils to release more land and build more water infrastructure in particular. And so the very specific measure, if I had a magic wand, it would be to improve councils' ability to fund water infrastructure, get the pricing right, get their access to finance right, get the incentives right, and maybe that's already happened with recent policy changes, and then watch 1,000 flowers bloom. And I think you'll see, the basic model in all of this is that good policy that works, policy that targets the right areas is going to fix, or it's going to raise all boats, and you're going to see inequality, among lots of other things, moving in the right direction.
Anna, could I quickly respond?
Please.
Just simply to say, I agree with Matt that housing is absolutely pivotal, but it's not enough. So it's necessary but not sufficient. And I, for one, don't support the idea of just simply paving ever more green fields with concrete. However the water infrastructure is funded, I'd much prefer we increase our housing density and go up. But I appreciate the problem there is NIMBYism, and that's a political problem. But from an environmental point of view, I think we need to ensure we keep our green belts around our cities and we protect valuable agricultural land from ever greater sort of increasions from urban sprawl, which also has big implications for transport and so forth. Anyway, that's enough from me.
Can I respond to that, if you don't mind? Look, I don't necessarily disagree, at least in gross terms, with Jonathan, but let's just get serious about the trade-offs here. Productive agricultural land, human consequences from having a persistent, severe undersupply of housing. That means you've got overcrowding in damp homes, people getting sick, high share of their incomes going on housing as opposed to everything else they'd like to enjoy in life. that's the trade-off, and I think it's pretty steep. And as nice as, you know, potatoes growing in productive land immediately outside Auckland might be, I'm much more concerned about the thousands, tens of thousands of people that are effectively locked out of the housing market right now. So, you know, the trade-off's very steep here.
But we can go up as well as out.
Indeed, and we should do both.
A policy one that I don't recall either of you mentioning is the proposed income insurance scheme. What do you think this would do to income inequality?
Not much.
Oh, Matt, do you want to go first?
I don't think it's going to do much. Actually, it's workers that are paying into the pool. It's workers that are drawing out from the pool, you know, compared to other things, you know, superannuation, other transfers, tax, housing. I don't think the scheme's, I think it's going to be pretty much a wash in terms of distribution.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that, but I would add two other elements. The first is what impact might an unemployment and health insurance scheme have on core benefit rates and the benefit system generally. There are concerns that some people I know that it would result in a less generous benefit system, which would then impact particularly on disadvantaged people. I'm not sure that the international evidence is consistent with that view. In fact, I think it's not. The second aspect, which I think we need to think about, is what impact would increasing the amount of social insurance in our system, moving beyond ACC and into unemployment and health, what will that do to the political economy of the welfare state and the way which people, ordinary voters, think about the welfare state? My reading of the international evidence is that social insurance tends to enhance support for the welfare state as an overall kind of entity. And it does that because when people are paying into schemes and getting earnings-related benefits if they need it because they become unemployed, there's a sense of reciprocity. People contribute and then they get assistance if they need it, in a way that a tax-funded, flat-rate, means-tested system of the kind that we have doesn't generate that kind of perspective. So very simply, I think there's a possibility that enhancing social insurance could actually help strengthen the welfare state, and to that extent actually help reduce inequality long run. But I may be wrong.
Jonathan, there's a specific question that's come through for you. You mentioned that income inequality is influenced in part by the people who are voting. Is there a case for reforming the way we vote to reduce the influence of older people and wealthier people?
Well, having said in my remarks that I believe in equal citizenship rights, I certainly have no desire to reduce the political rights of particular sections of the community. There is a case for reducing the voting age from 18 to 16. I happen to support that, but I don't think it would make a huge difference. But it might, if we did, ensure that younger people are more likely to vote, because it would mean that people would start voting at school, and it would get them familiar with the whole process of being a citizen and contributing to public life. But no, I don't think changing the electoral system is going to make any difference in the overall scheme of things to income and wealth inequality.
And a question that will take you both into some slightly different space: why does the toolbox to reduce income inequality not reach beyond tax, transfer, maybe even housing, Matt, and include investment in healthy early child development and skills? Matt, would you like to start with that one?
Well, look, I think it does. I mean, the whole idea of the social investment program under the previous government was to do exactly that, to find opportunities to invest early and make a huge difference. You know, with data, you need data to find these opportunities, and it's really hard to do, especially from the centre. That was the whole idea. So that absolutely is part of the toolkit. The problem is the technical difficulty of actually achieving it in a system from the centre. It's just hard to do, but I think it's going to happen. And
I'd completely agree with Matt. We only had 5 minutes, so it's not possible to kind of cover the whole raft of policies that influence income and wealth distribution, which obviously vast range of policies have some impact, covering health, housing, education, tertiary education, and so forth.
So that would certainly be another one that you might look at adding to the toolkit there. Let's move on to...
We already can spend quite a lot on early childhood education. Right. There is certainly a case, I think, for giving more weight to the early years relative to perhaps the later years of education. But we already invest quite heavily in that field.
Thanks. Let's perhaps take you to a broader question. There's been quite a theme of the impact of COVID, including on inequality, through a number of the presentations during the day. I wonder your views about whether COVID has permanently changed the dynamics of inequality in New Zealand. Has it done something permanent that's changed the dynamics, or is it just another transitory impact that that doesn't fundamentally change anything about the inequality situation in New Zealand?
I can have a go at that.
Go ahead, Matt.
So I thought of, maybe this is oversimplifying it, but I've thought of COVID as an exogenous shock that's come not as the product of economic malaise or malinvestment within the economy, but it's just come from the outside. It's hit us pretty hard, and it's caused disruption while it's here. But I've long thought that ultimately the fundamental dynamics within the economy don't need to change in response. And we can, have this sort of bullish view that we can bounce back rapidly, re-establish the networks that have been lost. They're still there. They may not be connected right now, but they can be re-established quickly because there isn't that normal thing you get in a recession of having to reorganize the economy, shut down businesses, free up capital, shift it to somewhere else and all of that. I think, so I've always felt that the recovery from COVID will be faster than it will be from other recessions. The thing that gives me pause, though, is that policy settings may not go back to what they were. Now we've got inflation and a lot of fiscal impulse still in the pipeline. And also Zoom, just the fact that people might be keep working from home after all of this. Those are potential longer lasting structural changes. None of it seems to have any obvious direct implication for inequality. You've got, the one thing you would say is you've got a bigger government coming out on the other side of this, and that may have, consequences for inequality. But in terms of COVID per se, I can't see anything for inequality in that.
Jonathan, do you share that view?
Can I say I broadly agree with Matt, but I would add two things. First, that if you think about this globally, many countries have experienced significant increase in their levels of public debt. And that runs the risk of exacerbating intergenerational inequality, particularly given that many of the people who have suffered quite a lot from COVID have been young people in school or in early years of work. Or in tertiary education. The second thing, though, is this, and this is, we will take years to find out, but I'm sitting in an office across the road from an encampment of thousands of people, most of whom are probably low income or unemployed or retired or semi-retired. Many of them, I think, are quite sort of marginalised from the mainstream of New Zealand society, and many of them are very aggrieved by what COVID has done to them. Some of them have lost their jobs because they've refused to be vaccinated, and so on. My sense is that COVID has, among other things, exposed and heightened some significant tensions and dislocations within our society, and that concerns me. And the effects of that could be quite long-lasting. I hope not, but I guess we'll find out.
One of the other, sorry, just to pick up on something Jonathan said, inflation, of course. What we are getting out of COVID is inflation, not just us, right around the world. That does have consequences for inequality. That will tend to hurt people at the bottom end. That's what inflation does. The good news is that certainly I think for New Zealand, it will be transitory. In 18 months, we will be back within 1 to 3%. That's and substantially because well, I've actually looked at the history of inflations, and they are about 2 years long on average. And actually, New Zealand's pretty well placed to recover from inflation. The institutions are sound. We've got an independent central bank, nice clean legislation. It's a good setup, and we've got low public debt, and that really counts. It makes the promise credible when the Reserve Bank says we're getting back to target. Now, consider the situation in Europe. Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank, has got 1 or 2 or 3 members that are going to exit rather in a disorderly way if interest rates rise too much further. Italy's sitting at 160% public debt. Greece is more than 200%. It's a serious problem when interest rates go up when it's time to fight inflation. So they're sitting there hoping that their inflation really is transitory and just COVID, nothing to do with all zero interest rates and spending. We'll wait and see. But for Europe, where debt is high, inflation is a serious problem. So, as a Feni reminder, we needed the value of fiscal prudence and a clean balance sheet. New Zealand's going to win relative, certainly to Europe and a lot of other countries in the OECD coming out of this.
Well, I agree with that, Matt, but just one, I guess, question mark, and that is what Russia does over the coming weeks and months, and then what the response might be. Okay. That could potentially have profound implications for oil markets and gas markets with long-term increases in fossil fuel prices, which may be good for climate change in the long run, but won't be good for global inflation.
But isn't it wonderful to be in a country that's crown debt of 40% and not 150?
Absolutely.
My gosh, nervous times in Italy, I would have thought.
And I think we're going to have to wrap this session up now, but of course these topics, including inflation, will be picked up again tomorrow when we have Adrian Orr presenting to us. Huge topics. I know we've only had time to scratch the surface of some of these, and we certainly haven't got into the data issues, and we've really focused more on New Zealand than global inequality, and that's a whole story in its own right as well. And I'm not sure whether your response to the COVID question would have been the same if the question had been on global inequality. But, thank you so much for your very, very rich insights, the expertise that you brought, the reminding us of this new data that's just out, Jonathan, and Matt reminding us not to take our eye off that housing market, because that really matters greatly for income disparities in New Zealand. So thank you so much. Thanks also to our audience, you guys who've been sending the questions through Slido. Really appreciate those, and with much gratitude, thank you very much to our panellists.
Thanks, Anna.